In 216 BC, on a hot summer day in southern Italy, the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean marched confidently toward what it believed would be a decisive victory. By sunset, that army would be almost completely destroyed. Nearly 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers would lie dead on a single battlefield, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. The man responsible? A Carthaginian general who had marched elephants over the Alps and invaded Italy against all expectations. His name was Hannibal Barca. The battle was called Battle of Cannae, and more than 2,000 years later, it is still studied in military academies around the world. This is the story of how Hannibal outthought, outmaneuvered, and outclassed the Roman Republic, and how Cannae changed military thinking forever. The road to Cannae. To understand Cannae, we must understand a larger conflict. The Second Punic War. This was not just a war between two states. It was a struggle for dominance of the Western Mediterranean between Rome and Carthage. After losing the First Punic War, Carthage rebuilt its power in Spain. From there, Hannibal launched one of the boldest campaigns in ancient history. In 218 BC, he crossed the Alps with tens of thousands of troops, including war elephants, and descended into northern Italy. The psychological impact alone shocked Rome. He then defeated Roman armies at the Battle of the Trebia, the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Each time, Hannibal used superior maneuvering and tactical deception. Rome panicked. The Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, who adopted a strategy of delay, avoiding large battles and wearing Hannibal down over time. This cautious approach became known as the Fabian strategy. But Rome was not comfortable with patience. The Roman political culture valued decisive action, honor, and aggressive engagement. Avoiding battle felt like weakness. So in 216 BC, Rome made a decision that would lead directly to Cannae. They would crush Hannibal with overwhelming force. Rome's massive gamble. The Roman Republic assembled one of the largest armies it had ever fielded. Approximately 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. It was a show of sheer manpower. The consuls for that year were Lucius Aemilius Paulus, Gaius Terentius Varro. Roman command structure required the two consuls to alternate command daily. This would prove significant. Varro was politically ambitious and favored aggressive engagement. Paulus was more cautious and experienced. Hannibal, meanwhile, commanded a smaller force, roughly 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. But his army was diverse and battle-hardened. Iberian infantry, Gallic warriors, African heavy infantry, Numidian cavalry. These were veterans of years of campaigning in hostile territory. By contrast, many Roman soldiers at Cannae were newly levied. Rome believed numerical superiority would guarantee victory. Hannibal believed discipline and positioning would decide the battle. The battlefield at Cannae. The battlefield lay near the small town of Cannae in southeastern Italy along the Aufidus River. The terrain was mostly flat and open, ideal for large infantry formations. Rome favored open battlefields where its heavy infantry could deploy in dense formations and push forward with sheer weight. Hannibal understood this, and he chose to fight there intentionally. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, Varro held command. He ordered the Roman army to deploy in an unusually deep formation, packing infantry into a dense central mass. The goal? Break through Hannibal's center by brute force. Rome placed its infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. Hannibal did something unusual. Instead of placing his strongest troops in the center, he positioned his weaker Iberian and Gallic infantry in a convex formation, bulging outward toward the Romans. Behind them, angled slightly back on both sides, stood his elite African infantry. His cavalry, particularly the Numidians, occupied the flanks. What looked like a thin, vulnerable center was actually bait, the double envelopment. As the battle began, the Roman infantry advanced aggressively. They pushed into Hannibal's center. The Carthaginian middle began to slowly fall back. This retreat was deliberate. Step by step, Hannibal's center absorbed the Roman pressure, bending inward from a convex shape into a concave one. The Roman soldiers believed they were winning. They pressed harder, but as they pushed forward, they moved deeper into a narrowing pocket. Meanwhile, on the flanks, Hannibal's cavalry achieved something decisive. On one wing, Carthaginian heavy cavalry quickly defeated the Roman cavalry. They then rode behind the Roman lines. On the other flank, Numidian cavalry engaged and fixed the remaining Roman horsemen. With the Roman cavalry eliminated or driven off, Hannibal now controlled the battlefield's mobility. Then came the decisive moment. As the Roman infantry advanced deeper into the concave center, Hannibal's African infantry on both flanks pivoted inward. They attacked the Roman formation from the sides. At the same time, Carthaginian cavalry struck from behind. The Romans were surrounded. This maneuver, attacking an enemy from both flanks and the rear simultaneously, is known as a double envelopment. At Cannae, it was executed with near-perfect timing. Discipline versus collapse. Once surrounded, the Roman army was trapped in a tightening circle. Packed tightly together, many soldiers could barely raise their weapons. Communication broke down. Command collapsed. Roman military strength depended on order and structured formations, but encircled and compressed, those advantages disappeared. Hannibal's troops methodically reduced the trapped mass. Ancient sources describe hours of slaughter. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were dead. Thousands more were captured. Consul Paulus was killed. Much of Rome's officer class was wiped out. It was one of the most devastating single-day losses in Roman history. For comparison, some historians estimate that proportionally, it rivaled or exceeded losses in many modern battles. And yet, Hannibal himself had lost far fewer men. It was not just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of operational brilliance. Why Cannae changed military thinking? Cannae became the textbook example of how a smaller force can destroy a larger one through maneuver. The double envelopment has been studied for centuries. Military theorists, including officers in modern academies, analyze Cannae to understand flank security, flexibility in formation, the importance of cavalry superiority, the dangers of overconcentration, command unity. Perhaps most importantly, Cannae demonstrated that aggression without coordination can be catastrophic. Rome had overwhelming manpower. Hannibal had superior battlefield control. But here is the real question. If Hannibal destroyed Rome's greatest army, why didn't Rome surrender? Why did Carthage ultimately lose the war? And how did this defeat reshape Roman military doctrine for centuries? That is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Rome's response and Hannibal's lost opportunity. Shockwaves through Rome. News of the disaster at Cannae did not arrive in Rome immediately, but when it did, the reaction was panic. The scale of the loss was almost unimaginable. Entire legions were gone. Senior magistrates were dead. Much of Rome's experienced military leadership had been wiped out in a single day. Ancient sources describe mourning across the city. According to Roman tradition, public grieving had to be limited because the scale of loss threatened civic stability. For Rome, this was not just a military defeat. It was an existential crisis. After earlier disasters at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Rome had rebuilt its armies. Now, after Cannae, there were barely enough men left to field another major force. Many of Rome's Italian allies began reconsidering their loyalty. Several southern Italian cities defected to Hannibal's side. Most notably, Capua, one of the wealthiest cities in Italy, switched allegiance to Carthage. From a strategic perspective, Hannibal's victory had achieved what few enemies ever managed. It cracked Rome's alliance network. And yet, Rome did not negotiate. It did not surrender. It did not collapse. Instead, the Roman Senate made one of the most important decisions in its history. They chose to continue the war at all costs. Why Hannibal did not march on Rome? One of the most debated questions in ancient military history is simple. Why didn't Hannibal march directly on the city of Rome after Cannae? According to later Roman accounts, one of Hannibal's cavalry commanders supposedly told him, "You know how to win a victory, but not how to use it." But modern historians treat that quote cautiously. The reality is more complicated. First, Hannibal did not possess the siege equipment necessary to assault a heavily fortified city like Rome. Second, although Rome had lost a massive field army, the city's walls remained intact, and significant forces still guarded it. Third, Hannibal's army was operating deep in enemy territory with stretched supply lines. He had expected that after repeated defeats, Rome's allies would abandon the Republic en masse. While some did defect, the majority of Central Italian allies remained loyal. Rome's strength was not just its army. It was its political system and alliance network. Without a complete collapse of that network, a direct siege of Rome would have been extremely risky. So instead of attacking Rome itself, Hannibal pursued a strategy of attrition and alliance building in southern Italy. But this shift gave Rome time to adapt. And Rome had learned from Cannae. Rome adapts. The Fabian strategy returns. After Cannae, Rome abandoned large-scale, direct confrontation with Hannibal. The cautious strategy first introduced by Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus * returned. Rather than seeking decisive battle, Roman forces avoided open-field engagements, harassed Hannibal's supply lines, targeted Carthaginian allies, rebuilt manpower reserves. Rome also implemented extraordinary emergency measures. They lowered the minimum age for military service. They recruited slaves with promises of freedom. They restructured surviving units. In essence, Rome mobilized its entire society for total war. This resilience shocked even Hannibal. He had destroyed Roman armies repeatedly, but Rome kept rebuilding them. Over time, the strategic balance began to shift. Hannibal could win battles, but he could not replace his losses as easily as Rome could. Carthage, meanwhile, failed to provide consistent large-scale reinforcements from North Africa. The war in Italy became a prolonged struggle, and while Hannibal remained undefeated in major field battles for years, he could not force Rome into surrender. The rise of Scipio. While Hannibal campaigned in Italy, Rome opened new fronts. One of the most important developments occurred in Spain. There, a young Roman commander began studying Hannibal's methods carefully. His name was Scipio Africanus. Scipio understood something critical. To defeat Hannibal, Rome would need to adopt flexibility, maneuver, and strategic boldness, traits Hannibal himself had demonstrated. In 209 BC, Scipio captured New Carthage in Spain in a daring assault. Later, he defeated Carthaginian forces at the Battle of Ilipa, using tactical deception that mirrored Hannibal's style. Instead of confronting Hannibal directly in Italy, Scipio proposed a bold plan: invade North Africa, force Carthage to recall Hannibal home. It was a strategic reversal. Rather than chasing Hannibal across Italy, Rome would attack Carthage itself. The Roman Senate approved. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa. Carthage had no choice. Hannibal was recalled after more than a decade in Italy. The two great commanders would finally face each other directly. Zama and the end of the war. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio met at the Battle of Zama. Unlike Cannae, this time Rome held the cavalry advantage. Scipio had secured Numidian allies, depriving Hannibal of one of his greatest strengths. The battle unfolded differently from Cannae. Hannibal attempted innovative tactics, including the use of war elephants, but Scipio adapted. Roman manipulator flexibility allowed them to absorb the elephant charge. Then, as at Cannae years earlier, cavalry played the decisive role. This time, Roman and allied cavalry returned to strike Hannibal's forces from the rear. The Carthaginian army collapsed. Hannibal was defeated. The Second Punic War ended shortly afterward. Carthage lost its overseas empire. Rome emerged as a dominant power in the western Mediterranean. The long-term military legacy of Cannae. Although Hannibal ultimately lost the war, Cannae remained one of the most studied tactical masterpieces in military history. For centuries, commanders analyzed its lessons. The concept of double envelopment became a model for decisive battle. Centuries later, military leaders such as Napoleon Bonaparte * studied ancient campaigns closely. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the German General Staff examined Cannae as a model for encirclement operations. Even during the Second World War, planners referenced Cannae when developing large-scale maneuver warfare concepts. Why? Because Cannae demonstrated timeless principles. 1. Superior numbers do not guarantee victory. 2. Tactical flexibility can defeat rigid formations. 3. Cavalry or modern mobility equivalents can determine outcomes. 4. Overextension in pursuit of apparent success can be fatal. 5. Command unity and coordination are essential. For Rome, Cannae reshaped military doctrine. Never again would Rome allow such a catastrophic encirclement without adaptation. The Roman legion evolved. Flexibility increased. Strategic patience became more valued. In defeat, Rome learned. And in learning, Rome survived. Cannae was not just a battle. It was a warning about overconfidence. It was a lesson in maneuver warfare. It was proof that brilliance on the battlefield does not always guarantee strategic victory. Hannibal delivered one of the most devastating tactical defeats in ancient history. But Rome endured, and in the end, endurance, not brilliance, decided the war. More than 2,000 years later, Cannae remains a case study in how armies win and how nations survive. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to Recorded Conflicts for more structured, evidence-based war history.